This is Jorge Mena Robles. Thank you so much, Nat. Buenos dias, everyone. Buenas tardes. I serve as the Associate Director of the Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, known as the LCC. Um, Today, you're joining us for our Zona Abierta virtual program. Zona Abierta is a Latino Cultural Center series which highlights the intersection of arts, humanities, science, culture, and civic life with presentations by local, national, and international artists, scholars, and community leaders. Today's program is the first virtual presentation of this semester's series that aims to highlight the research of postdoctoral scholars who are part of the Bridge to Faculty program at UIC. For those who may be unaware, the Bridge to Faculty program is a recruitment initiative within the Office of Diversity designed to attract underrepresented postdoctoral scholars with the goal of a direct transition to a tenure-track junior faculty position. We have hosted this series since the spring of 2022, and you can view all of the previous presentations on our LCC YouTube, and we can share that link in the chat. Now, I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Victor Florez-Garcia. Victor Florez-Garcia is a researcher and educator specializing in public health and epidemiology. He completed his PhD in environmental health sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where his dissertation focused on the impacts of real-world exposure to mixtures of toxic and nutrient metals on child cognition in Mexico City. Among other things, Victor has been an assistant professor at the Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia, where he also served as a methodologist and advisor in the Department of Public Health. His dedication to public health and epidemiology has earned him recognition as a significant figure in his field, both in Colombia and internationally. We're so grateful that you are joining us today to share more about your various work and experiences. The presentation will be about 35 minutes and will be followed by a short conversation facilitated by LCC staff, Nat Ayala. We invite you all to place comments and questions in the chat as we move along. That being said, welcome, bienvenido, Victor, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jorge, for having me today. Let me try to share my screen here. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right. So thank you so much for that great introduction, Jorge. And I know that to say epidemiology could be complicated sometimes. So yeah, epidemiology is like the part of the medical science, of a science in general, that we are evaluating environmental factors impacting health, both positively or negatively impacting cognition. So the title for my presentation today is Biological Causes of Neurodevelopmental Issues. This is mainly the role of environmental exposure. Even though I am working with epidemiology stuff, I have been mostly working with environmental exposure. I am biologist by training, so my expertise is in the side of more like environmental topics impacting cognition and impacting health, by the way. So this is like the index that I have for the conversation today afternoon. So initially, I want to talk about neurodevelopment, some key concepts, followed by environmental exposures. I will talk about approaches to avoiding risk factor, including those that we know that as traditional approaches versus those that are more last generation of approaches to evaluate cognition and environmental factors. Some conclusions about the talk and a Q&A section, of course. So first of all, neurodevelopment is the process by which the brain develops the system that controls learning, memory, and many other functions. So neurodevelopmental disorders are disabilities that mainly are associated with functioning of neurological system and also the brain. Now, between these neurodevelopmental disorders, we can probably, you all know these kind of different categories that I am showing you here. So this includes, for example, ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, conduct disorder, and so on and so forth. So definitely it's not just a single health outcome that we're going to find when we are talking about neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's more like a family of all of those disorders. Now, this is essential to know that even though we understand that several of these different health outcomes are evaluated in postnatal periods, several of these processes just start even from prenatal periods, as you can see here in this slide. So the intention with this slide is just to show you, for example, what is the role of how the different environmental exposure will impact the different steps across the brain development. So, for example, here you can see that in the first trimester, they will be usually will have like the closure of neuron 2 or proliferation of neurons and so on and so forth. So as you can see here, some of these neurons is just pointed out even in postnatal stages. What that means is that not necessarily several of these processes will just finish in prenatal. So several of those will be even in postnatal period, but also beyond childhood. For example, in glial cells and myelinization, just start in prenatal period, but also it will just continue until early adulthood. It's around 18 or 20 years old. This is like the final steps of the process of myelinization, for example. So in all these steps, it's essential to know what are those factors that are impacting, in this case, neurodevelopments, because it's usually the best way to tackle this situation. Also, because the brain, when in develop, usually is when we're going to find like more critical periods of the neurodevelopmental process. So that's why it's very important to know what is the how this step will be impacted by environmental pollutants. So this chart is just to show you the cross-sectional pictures of the brain, and it's just to say you that depending on their brain or the region in the brain that will be impacted by these kind of environmental pollutants or these kind of environmental exposures, depending on that area, we will find like the different elements or the different functions that will be impacted as well. In both sides, positive or negative. For example, if we evaluate here the cerebral cortex, which is the purple one that you can see here. So in general, we will find a negative impact in motor function area. But if we impact of the exposure impact, for example, the frontal area, we're going to find problems or huge problems in higher mental functions, including concentrations, planning, judgment, emotional expression, creativity, or even inhibition. Now, this is just to show you that there are several parts of the brain that will be impacted by the environmental exposure, and not even just environmental exposure, by the exposure in general. Now, how often these neurodevelopmental disorders occur? Approximately 15% of children in the United States, between 3 to 16 years old, were affected by neurodevelopmental disorder in this stage. This is 2006 and 2008, including here ADHD, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, autism, moderate to profound hearing loss, or even blindness. So all these different health outcomes are negatively impacted by environmental pollution. Of course, in different ways will be negatively impacted. Now, in the last year, I've been working mainly with intellectual functioning. So something that is important to know is that when we are talking about environmental functioning, it's not like a single health outcome, is more like a group of those. So children's neuropsychological assessment in general involves the close relationship between the brain and cognition or even behavior in the concept in the context of brain development. So according to the American Psychiatric Association, includes in the group of intellectual functioning skills such as reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking, judgment, academic learning, or even learning from experience. Now, we understand right now with the amount of body of literature that we have in this topic that neuropsychological results are increasingly useful as strong predictors of long-term neuropsychological performance. So that's why it's very important to identify that population who is probably in high risk of having some neuropsychological disorder even in early stage. Now, in this way, I have been working with functioning assessment, intellectual functioning assessment. This slide is just to show you that we have a lot of different tools to evaluate intellectual functioning in children. So as you can see here, for example, from 6 months until 2 years old, we can use Bailey scale, and this is just like one of the most popular tool that we're going to find in neurodevelopmental assessment. But after this stage, at 3 years, for example, or 4 years, we're going to find like Wechsler, preschool, and primary scale of intelligence, or even McCarthy scale of children's abilities. So there are a lot of different tools that we can use to evaluate neurodevelopmental issues, depending on, of course, the health outcome that we want to evaluate. Now, when I say that environmental pollutants impact conditions, I am talking about several environmental things. So here I have used a couple examples that I found very interesting from this paper that you can see here. So this is more like the environmental exposure for 2 different environmental exposures. In this case is mercury, for example, and something that we call PFAS. So in this case, for example, we can find 2 different ways. So here for methyl mercury, for example, we're going to find that mercury is a natural element that we're going to find in the earth. So it's part of the natural environment. Now, this kind of elements also sometimes is produced or is just synthesized by several companies or several industries. This kind of element will arrive just to some water sources, and then the animals living there will suffer by accumulation or even by amplification because of the natural environment where they actually are. Now, this kind of element, as you can imagine, we're going to include this kind of element in our diet. So that's how we usually obtain the different elements, in this case mercury, into the human body. Now we have the other side, as you can see here in these charts, is via manufacturing by chemical industry, and this is PFAS. PFAS stands for this, you can see here, perfluorinated aliphatic acid. So in this case, PFAS is, we use PFAS of water and oil repellent in consumer products for packages, and several other daily products that we right now have. Now, this in both cases, what we have here is in both cases we're going to find like the different elements will just arrive to the human body. In the case of neurodevelopment, we have a strong body of literature talking about that several of these different environmental pollutants will cross the placental barrier. So when that happens, usually that kind of element just reach the fetus in development, so affecting all these processes that you can see here, and also some of the previous one that I showed you before. Now, talking just about metal, for example, which is more like related with my area, my research area, as I mentioned, metals are very natural environmental stuff that we're going to find in our daily life, I would say. So metals have like a very physical, we use this kind of metal or some of these metals because of the physical properties, like good transmitting electricity or temperature or whatever physical property, depending on the environment that we are trying to evaluate. When we are talking about metals, we can just split these kind of elements in two huge groups. So we have essential metals versus those that are non-essential metals. So we just split it depending on if they are essential for biological function versus those that are not essential for biological function. So those that are essential for biological function, we understand, for example, here, zinc, selenium, copper, and so on and so forth. While those that are non-essential for biological function include, for example, lead, cadmium, cesium, barium, and so on and so forth. So definitely we have two different groups and very clear, two very clear groups impacting or not biological functions. On the other hand, we have POPs, for example. So POPs is also a kind of environmental pollutant. So POPs stand for persistent organic pollutants. And this is like the big name for a huge family. So these families include, for example, I have used highlight 4 different elements on this family, including, for example, PBDEs, PCBs, DDT, Mirex, and so on and so forth. These last two that you can see here, for example, Mirex or DDT, is this very spread around the world as insecticide, for example. So that's why it's very important to understand what is the impact to use these kind of elements, or how much of these elements here are just getting into the human body. Fortunately, for this convention in Stockholm in 2001, several of these elements were banned for regular usage, specifically for developed countries. However, the regulation is still a pending issue in those low and middle income countries. So this is a very nice example that I found here just to show you, for example, what is the impact of these kind of elements, or I call POPs, in prenatal exposures versus cognition in externalizing behavior or reading. So this paper was published in 2016, and this paper was basically the researchers here evaluate during pregnancy the concentration or different concentration of PBDE and PCB in pregnant women, and then they evaluate in offsprings, they evaluate reading, cognition, externalizing behaviors at 5 and 8 years old in this population. What they found in this paper, that I found this example very clear, is that, for example, here, as you can see here, keeping in mind that this is the reference point, all those population with all those children with higher concentration, or that were exposed to higher concentration of PBDE, were in this case had a lowest score. In this case is reading reading skills at 5 and 8 years old. Now, this was very significant. This was significant compared with with those population who have the lowest levels of concentrations. Now, when we evaluate, for example, this is in the right part of this slide, externalizing behavior problems, we found, like researchers found compared with the first, with those population, with those children who had like the lowest concentration or the lowest exposure to PBDE during pregnancy, those that have like the highest concentration or the highest level have problem externalizing behavioral problem. The score here was higher. What that means is that usually they have more problems just socializing or just generating some behavioral problems in the environment. Now, this is just an example just to show you how these kind of elements will impact cognition in children at early childhood. This kind of evaluation traditionally we have evaluated this kind of environmental pollutant, and in epidemiology in general, I would say we have evaluated in one exposure and one health outcome. What that means is that usually we try to isolate this exposure and then evaluate what is the impact on the health outcome that we are trying to evaluate, controlling, of course, for different other variables that are in the middle of this relationship. Now, this is a traditional approach, and this is a very valid approach that we can understand this kind of relationship. And this is not only applied for environmental epidemiology, this applies for social epidemiology or even clinical epidemiology, evaluating some risk factors on the health outcome and the specific health outcome. Now, something that we are trying to do to move forward regarding epidemiology evaluation or epidemiology approaches is in the umbrella of the exposome. What is the exposome? Well, when we are talking about exposome, we are trying to evaluate our many exposures and how these many exposures will impact some health outcome. The umbrella is exposome. So exposome means that what is all this exposure that we are just submitted during conception until we pass away. So this is like the entire exposure across our entire life. Of course, this is very complicated to isolate this kind of exposures and the different health outcome, but we are just moving forward the current literature in epidemiology in this way. Why? Well, it's important to evaluate or to tackle these traditional approaches or move forward to these more advanced statistical or epidemiological understanding of how health outcome appears. Because usually to be exposed to mixture is like the rule. I mean, usually we are not exposed just a one single exposure, and that exposure will produce, for example, just one specific health outcome. Stuff or exposure happen in mixture, in air, in water, in soil, in food. Whatever we want to evaluate, what is the source of that different environment pollutant, it comes with mixture. Now, what is a mixture? Well, we don't have like a strict definition about what is a mixture. However, we have some insights here. So according to the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, a mixture must have at least 3 independent chemicals or chemical groups. So generally, exposure to a mixture indicate exposure to multiple stressors simultaneously. This includes, for example, chemical or even non-chemical exposures, including, for example, socioeconomic status, diets, psychological factors, or problems in behavior, and so on and so forth. So definitely everything or every exposure that we want to evaluate, we need to keep in mind that there is like a bunch of different stuff behind that exposure. And in this scenario, we need to talk about mixture effect. So when we evaluate mixture in general, we need to keep in mind that the effect of individual exposures on health outcomes may differ when the exposure occurs alone or in the presence of another exposure as a mixture. In epidemiology, we call this like interaction effect. So it's like what is the modification depending on a third element that we are trying to evaluate. Mixture can be beneficial or detrimental effect on health outcome. And this is like the art of evaluate something from nothing. I like a lot this sentence, because usually when we are evaluating, for example, this individual exposure in the traditional methodology that I showed you before, we usually find like a very tiny effect in the health outcome. However, when we are evaluating the last literature have shown us that when evaluate those in a mixture fashion, we are finding very interesting results regarding the mixture effects in the health outcome or in specific health outcome that we are trying to analyze. Two important things when evaluating mixtures is the first of all, we need to identify what is the question that we want to evaluate. So defining the question of interest should be informed by the type of mixtures being measured, the hypothesis effect that we want to evaluate, or what is the effect that we want to evaluate at the end. And
I am the LCC Civic Engagement Educator, and I will be facilitating our Q&A for this program. Again, many thanks to Victor for your presentation and for sharing your research with us, right? You shared so much, and you could definitely tell how much of your time and your research you've really dedicated to doing this work. And so we do have a couple of questions already ready for you, but we also want to remind folks that the space is open to either insert your questions directly in the Q&A feature via Zoom, or you can also directly put your question in the chat as well. And so please post your questions on the chat or even raise your hand under the reaction button on Zoom so I can call on you throughout our kind of last 12 minutes with each other. And so while we wait for folks to gather their thoughts, we're going to begin with the first question, which is, the first question comes from an LCC staff member, and it is, for the 15% of children in the U.S. ages 3 to 17 years old affected by neurodevelopmental disorders, what is the demographic makeup? Who is the most affected? And can you talk more about the social factors that may lead us to understand which students are most impacted by these disorders? I know that was a long one, so I'm also going to put it in the chat so that everyone can see the question as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That's a really interesting question, definitely. So that paper is it's for free, the literature, as you can evaluate it carefully as well. And what I would say that it has been very well established as well that adult population, especially those underrepresented population, will be negatively impacted by these kind of elements. And it's not just because of it's not just because they are most impacted sometimes, depending, for example, what is the location or where they are living actually, but also what is the background that that kind of population have. So, for example, it's not the same to say that people who is living, for example, beside the companies that are just using this kind of products compared with the other ones that live in a very in a different area of, for example, Chicago, Northside Chicago, versus I don't know, like downtown Chicago, which is more polluted area. So in general, I would say that there are so many ways that this kind of population may be impacted, definitely. Yes. The other question is related with what are social factors that will cause this kind of exposure and the impact of this kind of health outcome. Well, I would say that in the Mexican example that I show you, for example, we understand that people, for example, people with less level of education will just try to keep this kind of tradition in the side. So it's very complicated to handle or to address this kind of exposure in population who don't understand completely what they are exposed, right? So usually this kind of environment, I would say, is the main topic. Now, here in the US is quite different because we are not using these kind of elements in our daily life. So here, for example, there were like a ban in gasoline, the usage of this gasoline in which is mainly the main exposure for these elements, and then we have like a very different scenario. So here, for example, in Detroit, we understand that in Detroit, one of the main topic or the sources for this kind of element is, for example, water. So lead is reaching people because of the water that they are using. So here in Chicago, it's kind of different as well. So usually here we want to find, like, for example, the paint have a lot of lead depending on the time that lead was, depending on the time where houses were built. So it's just to provide you like an example of several environmental factors that maybe can be impacted this population.
Thank you for that response. You kind of hit a few of the other questions that were asked with that question, or with that response, I'm sorry. And so another question that we have is, how can policymakers use your research to improve environmental health policies and or regulations?
That's a good one. That's a good question. Well, when we are trying to simulate interventions, as we did with the second example, for example, in Mexico, we are trying just to improve what is the results. So we are just trying not to say we are expecting something. We are just showing, for example, what is the result based on quantitative measurements and quantitative evaluation. And this is very rigorous science. So here, for example, in Milwaukee, I know that there is like a hypothetical intervention study that just showed us recently that those population banning the different coal plants for energy that are in the Milwaukee central area, downtown area, will just decrease, for example, will just increase in 2 grams the weight in children's. So what that means? That means that if we just follow that directions, we're going to find like very powerful health outcome, at least. Now, this is hypothetical. Yeah, so that's a key word here. This is hypothetical, and we probably will find like several other elements in the pathway to evaluate this kind of interventions in community.
Thank you for that response. Kind of related, another question that we have, which is also kind of a longer one, so I'll also be putting it in the chat. But could you briefly talk more about the differences in level of neurodevelopmental disorders between children in the USA versus Mexico versus other so-called developing countries? And is there a model country with lowest percentages of neurodevelopmental disorders?
That's a really nice question. I mean, that's just like a cross-country comparison that I would have. Well, actually, I have been working with, I'm from Colombia, so I know very well this kind of statistic from Colombia, from Mexico, and from the US, for example. And comparing just those 3 countries that I know very well, I would say that here in the US, there is like the lowest rate. So we want to find like the lowest rate in this kind of neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, something that we need to keep in mind when we are talking about the different prevalence of these kind of neurodevelopmental health outcomes is in general what tools people is using to evaluate that prevalence, right, at country level. Because it's not the same, for example, to evaluate here in the US versus Mexico or versus Colombia. We need to keep in mind what is the different tool that they evaluate, that we use to compare those 3 different countries, and then just to have like a general information. But yes, to make this short, the law to make this shorter, definitely in the US, we're going to find like the lowest rates for these neurodevelopmental disorders.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that response. Yeah, I feel like you're getting really cool, really specific questions for your research during this presentation. So it's really awesome to be able to hear you speak on this. We do have about 4 minutes left in the program, so we're going to close off with 2 final questions. And so one of the questions we have is, to your image of emissions, which again, this question is a little bit longer, to your image of emissions from natural sources and pollution and manufacturing by chemical industry leading to exposure via food, beverages, and water, what, if anything, can folks do or be conscious about consuming to reduce the impact of pollutants on our brains and bodies? And also, kind of as a secondary question to that, is what can we do to hold our city accountable for this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's important to know that there are so many ways that we can obtain this kind of pollutants, right? So, for example, it's going to be very different. The toxicokinetic, or it's going to be very different how an element will just be absorbed into the human body if we just inhalate that, compared with we, for example, just eat the products. So in general, for metal, for example, the literature is very clear regarding that. Inhalated in those metal that are that we are breathing, usually will have like a very strong impact in several health outcomes, not only in cognitions. That's the main reason for that, is that usually when we breathe the metals, they are already into the human body and will just cross all the barriers that we actually have, and will just disseminate across the human body completely. Now, with that said, I will say that probably some of the most important topics regarding these kind of elements, definitely all those that are compared with, for example, air quality stuff will be like the most important one. However, there are so many other sources. Like, for example, as I mentioned before, in Mexico, the main source for lead or flats is definitely the glazed pottery. And that means that we need to tackle these kind of elements. Now, the different sources going to be very different for the elements, for depending on the country that we are trying to evaluate, right? So here, as I mentioned, here, for example, the main source of water, of lead, going to be water or even paint, which is very different than Colombia, which is just paint, or is different, very different than Brazil, which is kitchen utensil, and so on and so forth. So definitely we need to keep in mind these kind of different elements, or these kind of different sources that we are trying to evaluate.
Thank you so much for that answer. Perfect timing. We are at 2:59, so our program ends in this next minute. But thank you again, Victor, for sharing your research with us. One more virtual round of applause for Victor. And we want to thank everyone for joining us for today's public program. This is actually our first of 3 virtual series that we're going to be hosting this semester, where folks like Victor will be able to share the research that they've been working on with all of us via Zoom. To everyone in the space, we already said our thanks to Victor. So this brings our program to a close. For those of you who are able to join us on campus, tomorrow we actually do have an in-person program at the Latino Cultural Center, located right off the quad at Lecture Center B2, where we'll be screening Jamaica and Tamarindo, Afro Tradition in the Heart of Mexico, and we're going to have a facilitator speak on the Afro-Mexican identity in Guerrero, Mexico City. So if you join us here today, hopefully we can see you tomorrow. Jorge also in the chat has put links to our upcoming public programs, and also follow us on social media if you don't already. And we're happy to see you here today, and hopefully we'll see you in our upcoming programs as well. Thank you so much, Victor.
Thank you.